My name is Camille Thornton-Wells, and I am 39 years old. 6 weeks ago, I sat in a mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Boston while a lawyer read my prenuptial agreement out loud to my former in-laws. The room smelled like old money and fresh coffee, the expensive kind, served in bone china cups that probably cost more than my first car. My mother-in-law, Judith Wells, sat across from me in a black Chanel suit, her pearls perfectly aligned, her expression arranged into what she probably thought was dignified grief. My father-in-law, Richard Wells III, sat beside her, his silver cufflinks catching the light every time he shifted in his leather chair. And between them, my former brother-in-law, Gregory, who had spent 12 years calling me a gold digger at every family gathering, holiday dinner, and private conversation he thought I couldn't hear. They were all there to collect, to divide, to take back what they believed was always theirs. What happened in that room changed everything, not just for them, for me, for the narrative they'd spent over a decade constructing, for the woman they dismissed, degraded, and underestimated since the day I walked into their lives. But I'll get to that. Before we get into this, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not to the conference room, not to the funeral, but to a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 15 years ago, when I met the man who would change my life, and the family who would spend the next decade trying to destroy me. I was 24 years old, working as a paralegal at a small immigration law firm while finishing my law degree at night. I had grown up in Dorchester, the daughter of a postal worker and a home health aide. My parents had immigrated from Haiti before I was born, worked 70-hour weeks my entire childhood, and instilled in me one unshakable belief: education was the door, and hard work was the key. I didn't come from money. I came from love, sacrifice, and the kind of determination that wealthy people often mistake for desperation. The day I met Jonathan Wells, I was soaking wet. My umbrella had broken 3 blocks from the cafe where I was supposed to meet a friend for lunch, and I'd arrived looking like something that had washed up on a riverbank. My hair was plastered to my forehead. My mascara was making a slow migration down my cheeks. My shoes squeaked against the hardwood floor with every step, announcing my arrival like a sad, soggy trumpet. I ordered a coffee and sat in the corner, trying to salvage what was left of my dignity with a stack of napkins. That's when he approached me. "You look like you're having an adventure," he said, standing beside my table with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I looked up at this stranger, tall, dark hair slightly graying at the temples, wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my rent, and said the first thing that came to mind. "If by adventure you mean slow-motion disaster, then yes, the adventure is going wonderfully." He laughed, not a polite laugh, the kind wealthy people give when they're being charitable to the less fortunate. A real laugh, surprised and genuine. He asked if he could join me. I said yes, and for the next 3 hours we talked about everything and nothing. Books we'd read, places we wanted to visit, the particular cruelty of Boston weather, and broken umbrellas. He didn't tell me his last name was Wells. He didn't mention that his family's name was on 3 buildings at Harvard, 2 hospital wings, and a wing of the Museum of Fine Arts. He just told me he was Jonathan, that he worked in finance, that he'd been married briefly in his 20s to someone his parents had approved of, and that he'd spent the last 5 years realizing that approval and happiness were not the same thing. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him. When he called the next day, I answered. When I fell in love with him, I had no idea what I was falling into. Jonathan and I dated for 8 months before I met his family. He kept finding reasons to delay it, scheduling conflicts, business trips, renovations at the family estate. At the time, I thought he was just private. I thought wealthy people moved slowly, carefully, protecting their inner circles the way my parents protected their Sunday dinners. I didn't realize he was protecting me. The first meeting was at the Wells family home in Beacon Hill, a 4-story brownstone that had been in the family since the 1800s. Jonathan held my hand as we walked up the steps, and I remember thinking how cold his fingers were, how tightly he was gripping. "They can be a lot," he said quietly. "Just be yourself. That's all I want." The door opened before we could knock. A woman in a gray uniform, household staff I'd learn later, led us through a foyer larger than my entire apartment, past oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, into a sitting room where the Wells family waited like a tribunal. Judith Wells rose first. She was 63 at the time, impeccably preserved, the kind of woman who'd never worked a day in her life but carried herself like she ran a Fortune 500 company. Her eyes traveled the length of my body, my department store dress, my secondhand heels, my carefully applied drugstore makeup, and I could see the calculations happening behind her practiced smile. "How, noble?" Judith said, the word dripping with condescension. "Service work is so important. Someone has to do it." I set my fork down. Yes, someone does. My parents have spent their entire lives serving others, and they raised me to believe that a person's worth isn't determined by their profession or their last name. It's determined by their character. The table went silent. Jonathan squeezed my hand under the tablecloth. Richard raised an eyebrow, almost impressed. And Judith's smile tightened into something that wasn't a smile at all. I'd made an enemy that night. I just didn't know how committed she would become. Jonathan proposed 9 months later on a beach in Maine where his family owned a summer cottage. Though calling it a cottage was like calling the Titanic a boat. The ring was beautiful, a vintage sapphire surrounded by diamonds, something he'd chosen himself rather than pulling from the family vault. "I wanted it to be ours," he said, when he slipped it on my finger. "Not theirs, just ours." I said yes. Of course I said yes. I loved him in a way that felt dangerous. The kind of love that makes you forget to protect yourself, that makes you believe the best in people who don't deserve your trust. The engagement party was held at the Wells estate 2 weeks later. Judith insisted on planning it. And I was foolish enough to believe this was an olive branch. Perhaps she was warming to me. Perhaps she was accepting that Jonathan had made his choice. I was wrong. The party was elegant. Champagne towers, a string quartet, 200 guests who all seemed to know each other from boarding schools and charity galas. I wore a dress I'd saved 3 months to afford, a deep green silk that Jonathan said matched my eyes. I thought I looked beautiful. Judith made sure I knew otherwise. "Interesting choice," she said when I arrived, her eyes sweeping over my dress. "Very bold. Not everyone can pull off that color with your complexion. But you're certainly brave to try." The comments continued all evening. Small cuts, delivered with a smile. My hair was exotic. My accent was charming. My family's absence was understandable, given the circumstances. Each one landed like a paper cut, too small to make a scene over, too sharp to ignore. But the worst moment came in the powder room, at the end of the night, when I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I was in one of the stalls, touching up my makeup, when the door opened, and 2 women entered. I recognized Judith's voice immediately. The second voice belonged to her sister Margot, equally wealthy, equally vicious, equally convinced that Jonathan was making a catastrophic mistake. "She's pretty enough, I suppose," Margot was saying. "In that common sort of way." "Pretty fades," Judith replied. "And then what?" "She has no connections. No family money, no understanding of how our world works." "You don't think she's after the money?" Judith laughed, a cold, brittle sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Of course she's after the money. What else could she possibly want? A paralegal from Dorchester marrying into the Wells family? Please. She saw an opportunity, and she took it. The oldest trick in the book. What are you going to do?" "Whatever I have to. Jonathan will come to his senses eventually. They always do. And when he does, I'll make sure there's nothing left for her to take." I stood frozen in that stall, hand pressed against the cool marble wall, listening to my future mother-in-law plot my destruction like I was a business problem to be solved. When they left, I looked at myself in the mirror. My makeup was perfect. My dress was beautiful, and I had never felt uglier in my life. I didn't tell Jonathan what I heard. Not that night. I was too shocked, too hurt, too uncertain of what it meant. Part of me hoped I'd misunderstood. Part of me hoped Judith would change. Part of me still believed that love could conquer everything. Even a woman with unlimited resources and unlimited contempt. If you've ever been in a situation where your in-laws refused to accept you, where you were judged for where you came from rather than who you are, drop a fire emoji in the comments. And if you think Judith is going to regret this, type karma. The wedding was a battlefield disguised as a celebration. Judith insisted on planning it. She insisted on the venue, a historic estate in Newport that had hosted 3 generations of Wells weddings. She insisted on the guest list, 400 people, most of whom I'd never met. She insisted on the caterer, the flowers, the music, the photographer. Every detail was Wells approved, and I was treated less like a bride and more like an accessory that needed to be coordinated with the color scheme. My parents came. They wore their best clothes. My father in a suit he'd bought for my brother's graduation 10 years earlier. My mother in a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd saved for months to afford. They looked beautiful to me. They looked out of place to everyone else. Judith seated them at table 19, near the kitchen, behind a pillar. I found out during the reception when I went looking for my mother and found her standing alone in a corner, trying not to cry. Man, I said, switching to the Creole we spoke at home. What happened? What's wrong? Nothing, Sherry. She wiped her eyes quickly, forcing a smile. It's a beautiful wedding. You're a beautiful bride. I'm just overwhelmed. But I knew my mother. I knew when she was lying to protect me. The room went silent. Judith's face went white. I want to make something clear, Jonathan said, looking directly at his mother. Camille is my wife. Her family is my family. And anyone who cannot treat them with the dignity they deserve is not welcome in our lives, regardless of whose name is on the invitation. He handed the microphone back. He walked to my parents and embraced them both. And then he took my hand and led me to the dance floor, leaving his mother frozen at her table, publicly corrected in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress. I loved him more in that moment than I'd ever loved anyone in my life. But Judith didn't forgive. Judith didn't forget. She simply recalibrated, and what had been coldness became war. The first 5 years of our marriage were a constant siege. Judith never attacked directly. She was too sophisticated for that. Instead, she worked through proxies, through whispers, through the slow erosion of social standing that only old money truly understands. She made sure I was excluded from family photos at gatherings. She mentioned my background at every opportunity, always with that practiced smile. Always in ways that sounded like compliments but cut like knives. She referred to me, consistently, as Jonathan's little project, as if I were a renovation he'd undertaken rather than a person he'd married. Gregory was worse. Where Judith was subtle, Gregory was crude. He called me the maid when Jonathan wasn't in earshot. He asked at every holiday dinner whether I'd signed a prenup. He speculated openly about how quickly I'd cash out once I got tired of pretending to love his brother. Everyone knows why you're here, he told me once, cornering me in the kitchen at Thanksgiving while I was helping the caterers, something Judith had never done in her life and therefore found deeply suspicious. You saw a meal ticket and you grabbed it. But don't worry, Jonathan's not as smart as he thinks he is. He'll figure it out eventually. I didn't respond. I had learned by then that engaging with Gregory only made things worse. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to yell, to cry, to prove that I was the volatile, unstable gold digger he'd convinced himself I was. Instead, I smiled, picked up a tray of appetizers, and walked away. But the constant assault took its toll. Not on my marriage. Jonathan and I were solid, united against his family's campaign. But on me, personally, I started dreading family events. I developed anxiety before every holiday, every birthday, every inevitable encounter with people who saw me as an intruder in their world. And then something changed. I have to pause here. What do you think changed? Option A, Judith finally accepted me. Option B, I discovered something about the Wells family they didn't want known. Option C, Jonathan's father had a crisis that changed everything. Drop your answer in the comments. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because the next part of this story is where everything changes. The answer was B, but it happened in a way I never expected. year 7 of our marriage. Jonathan was traveling for work, and I was home alone in the brownstone we'd bought in Back Bay, purchased with money we'd earned together, I should add. By this point, I'd finished law school, passed the bar, and built a successful practice specializing in immigration law. I wasn't the paralegal from Dorchester anymore. I was a partner at my own firm, with clients who respected me and colleagues who saw me as an equal. Not that any of that mattered to Judith. To her, I would always be the girl from the cafe, the gold digger who tricked her son, the stain on the family name that needed to be removed. That afternoon, I was working from home when I received an unexpected package. No return address. Just my name, handwritten in elegant script that looked somehow familiar. Inside was a folder of documents, bank statements, legal filings, internal memos, all relating to the Wells family trust. I shouldn't have read them. They weren't addressed to me, not really. But something about the anonymity of it, the deliberate secrecy, made me curious, and what I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about the Wells family. The documents revealed that the Wells fortune, the money they'd lorded over everyone for generations, was largely built on fraud, not recent fraud. Historical fraud dating back to the 1950s, when Richard's father had systematically cheated dozens of immigrant families out of their properties during the urban renewal projects that displaced entire neighborhoods in Boston. Properties in Dorchester? Properties in Roxbury. Properties that had been stolen through forged documents, bribery, and legal manipulation that targeted families who couldn't afford lawyers, who didn't speak English well, who trusted the system to protect them. Families like mine. I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread in front of me, hands shaking. The Wells family hadn't just looked down on people like my parents. They'd literally stolen from them, built their empire on the backs of immigrants they now treated like dirt beneath their designer shoes. The package had included a note typed on plain white paper. The truth is its own inheritance. Use it wisely. I never found out who sent it. I have my suspicions. A disgruntled employee, a distant relative with a conscience, perhaps even someone inside the Wells organization who'd grown tired of the hypocrisy. But it didn't matter. What mattered was what I did with the information. I didn't use it. Not yet. I didn't expose them, didn't threaten them, didn't even tell Jonathan. Instead, I filed it away. I kept it safe. I waited. Because I'd learned something important by then. Powerful people don't fear exposure in the moment. They fear exposure when they're vulnerable. When they've already committed, already acted, already revealed their true intentions. Judith thought she was fighting a gold digger. She didn't realize she was fighting someone who understood exactly how to play the long game. Jonathan got sick in year 10. It started with fatigue, then headaches, then a scan that showed what no scan should ever show. A mass in his brain. Aggressive, inoperable, the kind of diagnosis that turns your entire world into a countdown. The doctors gave him 2 years. He lasted 3. 3 years of treatments that drained him. 3 years of hope and devastation, remission and relapse. 3 years of watching the man I loved disappear piece by piece, while his family circled like vultures, waiting to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. During his illness, Judith's behavior shifted. Not toward kindness, she wasn't capable of that, but toward strategy. She started visiting more often, always with lawyers in tow. She brought documents for Jonathan to sign, just to simplify things later. She talked about the estate, the trust, the family legacy, with an urgency that made her priorities clear. She wasn't there to comfort her dying son. She was there to make sure I didn't get his money. One afternoon, about 6 months before he passed, Jonathan asked to speak with me privately. We were in our bedroom, the same bedroom where we'd spent a decade falling asleep in each other's arms, and he looked smaller somehow, diminished by the disease that was stealing him from me. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I should have told you years ago." I took his hand. It was so thin now, the bones visible beneath the skin. "The prenup," he said. "My mother thinks she knows what's in it. She thinks I protected the family money. She's been banking on that since the day we got married." Jonathan. "Let me finish." He squeezed my hand. "When we got engaged, my mother demanded a prenup. You know that. What you don't know is what I actually put in it. I stared at him, confused. My mother never read it, he said. Not the final version. She read the draft her lawyers prepared, the one that protected the Wells' assets, that limited your claim to anything, that treated you like the gold digger she convinced herself you were. But that's not what you signed? He smiled. That same smile from the cafe, the one that had made me fall in love with him 15 years ago. I signed something very different, he said. I had my own lawyer draw it up. Someone who wasn't on my mother's payroll. Someone who understood what I wanted. What did you want? He looked at me with eyes that held no regret, no hesitation, no doubt. I wanted to protect you, he said. From them. Forever. The hospice nurse said he went peacefully, but I don't know if I believe in peaceful deaths. I believe in endings, and his ending broke me in ways I'm still discovering. The funeral was 3 days later. Judith planned it, of course. She'd taken over the moment Jonathan lost consciousness for the last time, sweeping into our home with her army of assistants, making decisions about her son's memorial without consulting his wife. I was too exhausted to fight, too hollowed out by grief to care about flower arrangements and eulogies. 500 people came. Politicians, business leaders, old money families from every corner of New England. They filed past the casket, murmuring condolences, performing sorrow, and Judith stood at the entrance like a receiving line, accepting sympathy as if she were the one who'd lost a husband rather than a son. Gregory found me during the reception, standing alone by a window, watching rain streak down the glass. So, he said, swirling a glass of whiskey, I suppose you'll be moving on now. I didn't respond. It's been a good run, he continued. 12 years. Not bad for a gold digger from Dorchester. But the gravy train's over now. I hope you saved some of what you spent. I turned to look at him. This man who had made my life miserable for over a decade. This man who had called me a gold digger, a maid, a charity case. This man who had no idea what was coming. The will reading is next week, I said quietly. I suppose we'll see who's been saving what. Something flickered in his eyes. Not doubt. Gregory was too arrogant for doubt. But curiosity. Calculation. Mother's lawyers have already reviewed the estate plan, he said. The prenup protects everything. You'll get the house, maybe some personal effects, but the Wells money stays with the Wells family, where it belongs. I smiled. The first real smile I'd managed in months. I guess we'll see, I said. Then I walked away, leaving him standing by that window with his whiskey and his certainty, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. The reading of the will took place 6 weeks after the funeral, in the same mahogany-paneled conference room where this story began. Judith had requested a delay to process the grief she claimed, though I suspect she was using the time to prepare legal challenges to whatever minor inheritance I might receive. The lawyer handling the estate was named Harrison Crawford III, a senior partner at the oldest firm in Boston, a man who had represented the Wells family for 40 years. He sat at the head of the table with a stack of documents in front of him, reading glasses perched on his nose, expression carefully neutral. Judith sat on his right, dressed in impeccable black, her pearls gleaming. Richard sat beside her, looking uncomfortable in the way he always looked uncomfortable when anything serious was happening. Gregory was on Judith's other side, already wearing a satisfied smirk, already counting money he hadn't yet received. I sat across from them. Alone. The widow against the family. Before we begin, Harrison said, I want to note that the documents we'll be reviewing today include both the will and the prenuptial agreement that was executed before Mr. and Mrs. Wells's marriage. Per Mr. Wells's instructions, the prenup is to be read in its entirety before the will is discussed. Judith nodded, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. Of course, the prenup will clarify everything. She looked at me, that same look from the powder room, 12 years ago. The look of a woman who believed she'd already won. Harrison opened the folder. The prenuptial agreement between Jonathan Richard Wells and Camille Marie DesRoches Wells, dated April 15th, 2012. He began to read. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper and the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Section 1. Definitions. For the purposes of this agreement, separate property shall be defined as follows. Boring, technical, the kind of thing that makes people's eyes glaze over. Judith was nodding along, her expression becoming more satisfied with each paragraph. Then, Harrison reached Section 4. Section 4. Division of assets in case of death. He paused, adjusted his glasses. In the event of the death of either party, all assets held jointly or individually shall be distributed as follows. He read the next paragraph. The room went silent. Judith's face went white. "Read that again," she said, her voice strangled. "Read that section again." Harrison looked at her over his glasses. "Mrs. Wells, I assure you—" He did. "In the event of my death, I, Jonathan Richard Wells, bequeath all assets, holdings, investments, properties, and interests, including but not limited to my shares in the Wells Family Trust, my stake in Wells Holdings LLC, and all personal accounts and properties, to my wife, Camille Marie Desrosiers Wells. This bequest is absolute, irrevocable, and supersedes any prior arrangements, including but not limited to the Wells Family Trust distribution protocols." That's impossible. That's not the prenup we reviewed. That's not Access Trader with prepaid and straight for opportunities. That's not bad. Mr. Wells, Harrison said calmly, this document was executed in the presence of 3 witnesses, notarized, and filed with the court 12 years ago. It is legally binding and fully enforceable. My lawyers reviewed the prenup, Judith hissed. They reviewed it before the wedding. It protected the family assets. This is fraud. Harrison pulled out another document. With respect, Mrs. Wells, your lawyers reviewed a draft. The final executed version was never shared with you. That was Mr. Wells' explicit instruction. He turned to me. Mrs. Wells, Camille, were you aware of the contents of this agreement? I looked at Judith, at Gregory, at the man who had spent a decade calling me a gold digger. Not until 6 months before my husband died, I said. He wanted me to know that he had protected me, that no matter what his family tried to do after he was gone, I would be secure. This is insane, Gregory sputtered. She manipulated him. She took advantage of a dying man. This will be challenged. This will be thrown out. She's not entitled to a single act. There's more, Harrison interrupted. Harrison Crawford III shuffled his papers and cleared his throat. The room was vibrating with tension. Judith's rage barely contained, Gregory's face a mottled red, Richard staring at the table like he wished he could disappear into it. Mr. Wells included a personal statement, Harrison said. He requested that it be read aloud in its entirety before any discussion of the estate. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. Jonathan's handwriting. I'd recognize it anywhere. To whoever is present at this reading, Harrison began, his voice steady. I am writing this knowing that my time is limited, and that certain truths need to be spoken that I wasn't brave enough to speak while I was alive. Judith's hands were gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. For 12 years, I have watched my family treat the woman I love with cruelty, contempt, and disrespect. I have watched my mother call her a gold digger. I have watched my brother call her a maid. I have watched them seat her parents at the back of our wedding, exclude her from family photos, and make her feel like an intruder in her own life. Harrison's voice remained neutral, professional, but I could see even he was affected by what he was reading. And I have watched Camille respond to all of this with grace, dignity, and a patience that none of them deserved. She never asked me to choose. She never demanded that I cut ties. She simply loved me, supported me, and built a life with me despite the constant attacks from people who should have welcomed her. I felt tears streaming down my face. I hadn't expected this. Jonathan had told me about the prenup, about the protection, but he hadn't told me about this letter. To my mother, you spent 12 years trying to prove that Camille was after my money. You failed. Not because she was clever, but because you were wrong. She built her own career, her own reputation, her own wealth. She didn't need my money. She never did. What she needed was a family that would treat her with basic human decency. You couldn't provide that. Judith made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. But her face was hard, her eyes dry. To my brother, every time you called Camille a gold digger, you revealed exactly who you are. A man so defined by his inheritance that he can't imagine anyone valuing anything else. You've never built anything. You've never earned anything. You've simply waited for money you didn't work for and judged everyone who had to work for theirs. I hope this reading teaches you something about the value of character over cash. He looked like he wanted to flip the table. And to Camille, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't defend you loudly enough, soon enough, often enough. I'm sorry I let them hurt you while I tried to keep the peace. You deserved better. You deserved a husband who chose you publicly, every time, without hesitation. I hope this document is some small correction of that failure. Harrison set the letter down. The final section of the will, he continued, includes specific bequests. To Judith Wells, $1. To Gregory Wells, $1. To Richard Wells III, the family Bible and a collection of photographs from Mr. Wells's childhood, $1. Jonathan had left his mother and brother $1 each. The silence in that room was absolute, complete, the kind of silence that follows a detonation. Judith stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Her face was a mask of fury, her composure finally cracking. You, she said, pointing at me. You did this. You manipulated him. You turned him against his own family. I looked at her, this woman who had spent 12 years trying to destroy me, this woman who had seated my parents by the kitchen, this woman who had called me a gold digger in powder rooms and at holiday dinners and in whispered conversations she thought I couldn't hear. I didn't do anything, I said quietly. I just loved your son, and he loved me enough to protect me from you. This isn't over, Gregory spat. We'll contest this. We'll have it thrown out. We'll prove undue influence. Harrison spoke up. Mr. Wells, the documents were executed 12 years ago, when Jonathan was in perfect health. There are multiple witnesses, medical evaluations, and a paper trail that will make any challenge extremely difficult. Additionally, the will includes a no-contest clause. Anyone who challenges the distribution will forfeit their entire inheritance. We already got $1, Gregory sneered. What else is there to lose? The no-contest clause extends to the Wells Family Trust, Harrison said, which, as you may know, distributes annual payments to family members based on their standing with the primary trustee. If you contest this will, you'll be removed from the trust entirely. That stopped Gregory cold. Judith looked at me one last time. There was no defeat in her eyes, just cold, calculating hatred. This isn't over, she said again. Then she walked out. Gregory followed. Richard lingered for a moment, looking at me with something almost like respect, then left as well. I sat in that conference room for a long time after they were gone. Harrison offered me water, condolences, contact information for any questions. Then he left too, and I was alone with the silence. I looked at Jonathan's letter still lying on the table. His handwriting, his words, his final gift. I picked it up, folded it carefully, and put it in my purse. I would frame it later, hang it somewhere I could see it every day. A reminder of who he was, who we were, what love looks like when it's real. They called me a gold digger for 12 years. They thought I wanted the money. What I wanted was respect, dignity, the basic decency of being treated like a human being. Jonathan gave me all of that, not just in the prenup, not just in the will, but in the life we built together. In the Sunday mornings and the private jokes and the way he held my hand at family dinners while his mother glared at me across the table. The money is nice. I won't pretend it isn't. But it was never the point. The point was this. They underestimated me. They underestimated us. And in the end, their underestimation was the only gold they managed to dig. My name is Camille Thornton-Wells. I am 39 years old. I am a widow, a lawyer, and the sole heir to one of the largest fortunes in New England. And I am proof that the people who look down on you are not writing your story. You are. They called me disposable, temporary, a phase he'd get over. He left me everything. That's not revenge. That's not karma. That's love. And love, it turns out, has the final word.